A loud bang echoed across the freezing Walmart parking lot just as the sun began to rise. Three small boys sitting in a pickup truck looked up at the exact same moment. Across the parking lot, a Walmart manager was pounding his fist against the fog-covered window of a parked sedan. Inside the car, someone suddenly moved, and whatever was happening inside that vehicle immediately caught the attention of Ethan Carter's 7-year-old triplets. The early winter morning in Cedar Ridge, Ohio, carried the kind of cold that crept into your bones. The Walmart parking lot was still half empty, with only a few early shoppers walking toward the automatic doors. Ethan Carter pulled his old pickup truck into a space near the entrance and turned off the engine. In the back seat, three identical voices began talking at once. "Dad, are we getting cereal today?" Liam asked. "Can we get the blue box this time?" Noah added quickly. Mason leaned forward between the seats, holding the dented metal lunchbox he carried everywhere. Ethan rubbed his tired eyes before answering, "Maybe. Depends what's on sale." Money had been tight for months, and the boys knew it even if Ethan never said it out loud. Still, he smiled at them before stepping out of the truck. "Stay here a minute. I'll grab a few things." The boys nodded. The moment the truck doors shut, the parking lot felt quiet again. But only for a few seconds. Noah suddenly leaned toward the passenger window. "Hey, look at that car." About 6 parking spaces away sat an older gray sedan. Its windows were completely fogged over from the inside. Liam squinted at it. "Why are the windows like that?" Mason pressed his face closer to the glass. "Maybe someone's inside." That possibility made all three boys go quiet. The car clearly hadn't moved for a long time. Frost covered the edges of the windshield, and then something unexpected happened. The Walmart store manager, Harold Dixon, came striding across the parking lot with long, impatient steps. He stopped beside the sedan. Then he raised his hand and banged loudly on the window. The sudden sound made the boys jump in their seats. Inside the car, a figure stirred. A woman slowly lifted her head from the front seat, blinking in confusion. But the manager didn't soften his voice. "Ma'am, you can't stay here," he said sharply through the glass. The boys watched as the woman quickly wiped the fog away from the window and rolled it down a few inches. Her hair was messy, and a blanket was draped across her shoulders. For a moment, she looked disoriented. Then she realized where she was. And more importantly, she realized how many people were staring. A couple walking toward the entrance slowed down to watch. Another shopper paused beside a shopping cart. The quiet tension spread across the parking lot like a ripple. The manager crossed his arms. "You've been here all night, haven't you?" The woman hesitated. Her eyes flickered around the lot before she answered softly. "I was just resting." "That's not allowed," he snapped. "This isn't a campground." Back in the truck, Liam frowned. Why is he yelling at her? Noah tilted his head. Maybe her car broke. But Mason kept staring at the fogged windows. What if she was sleeping? Just then, Ethan walked out of the store carrying a small grocery bag. He didn't notice the situation immediately, but the boys did, and Liam didn't lower his voice when he asked the question that suddenly carried across the cold air. "Dad, why is that lady living in her car?" The words landed like a stone. Several people turned toward the truck. The manager heard it too, and for some reason the comment made his tone even harsher. "You need to move along," he told the woman. "Right now." The woman lowered her eyes. Embarrassment washed over her face. For a moment she said nothing. Then Ethan finally noticed the scene unfolding nearby. He slowed his steps as he approached the truck. "What's going on?" he asked. All three boys pointed at the same time. Ethan followed their gaze. Across the parking lot he saw the manager standing beside the car. He saw the woman sitting inside with a blanket around her shoulders. And he saw something else. The woman's hand was gripping a thin silver bracelet on her wrist, like it was the only steady thing she had. The parking lot had grown strangely quiet. People were watching, but no one was stepping forward. Ethan rested his arm on the truck door as he studied the scene. Grace Bennett hadn't planned to wake up like this. She hadn't planned for anyone to notice she'd spent the night in her car. And she definitely hadn't planned for a small crowd to watch the moment her situation became public. The manager pulled out his phone. "If you're not gone in 5 minutes," he warned, "I'm calling the police." Inside the truck, Mason's small voice broke the silence. "Dad." Ethan looked down. Mason was staring at the woman with wide, worried eyes. "Dad, she looks really cold." For a brief moment, Ethan said nothing. But as he looked back toward the car again, something about the situation didn't feel right anymore. And that feeling was about to change everything. The manager lifted his phone and began dialing. But before the call could connect, Mason suddenly grabbed something from his lunchbox and opened the truck door. And what the child did next was something no one in that parking lot expected. Instead of getting back into his truck and driving away like everyone else in the parking lot, Ethan Carter did something that made several people stop and stare. He started walking toward the woman in the car. The cold morning air followed Ethan across the Walmart parking lot as he approached the gray sedan. The store manager, Harold Dixon, was still standing beside the driver's door with his phone in hand, clearly ready to call the police. The phone in hand, clearly ready to call the police. Woman inside the car sat stiffly behind the wheel, her blanket pulled tightly around her shoulders. She looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. Ethan slowed his steps when he reached them. "What's going on here?" he asked calmly. The manager turned toward him with clear irritation. "She's been sleeping here overnight," Harold said. "That's against store policy." Inside the car, the woman avoided eye contact. "I was just resting," she said quietly. Her voice sounded tired, not offensive, not angry, just tired. Ethan glanced through the window. The back seat was filled with folded blankets, a backpack, and a small cooler. The signs were obvious now. This car wasn't just transportation. It was where she had been living. Back at the truck, the triplets had opened their doors and were now standing beside the vehicle watching everything unfold. Liam crossed his arms. "Why is everyone mad at her?" he asked. Noah studied the car carefully. "She probably needed somewhere warm," he whispered. Mason didn't say anything at first. He simply walked a few steps closer, still holding his metal lunchbox. The manager noticed the boys and frowned. "Sir, you should really move your kids away from this situation," he said to Ethan. But Ethan didn't move. Instead, he looked at the woman again. Up close, he noticed how pale she looked. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the edge of the blanket, and something else caught his attention. On her wrist was a thin silver bracelet. Her fingers kept touching it, like it was something important, something she didn't want to lose. But before Ethan could say anything, Mason stepped closer to the car window. The small boy tilted his head. Then he asked a question so simple that it immediately changed the mood in the entire parking lot. "Did you eat breakfast today?" The woman looked up in surprise. For a second, she didn't seem to understand the question. Then she slowly shook her head. "No," she said softly. The parking lot fell quiet again. A few people nearby exchanged awkward looks. The manager cleared his throat. "That's not the point here," he said. "She needs to leave the property." But Mason was still standing beside the car. He glanced back at his father. "Dad, she's hungry." Ethan exhaled slowly. Then he turned toward the store entrance again. "Hold on," he said. The manager frowned. "Sir, this really isn't your problem." But Ethan didn't answer. He simply walked back inside the Walmart. For a few minutes, the parking lot returned to its uneasy silence. The woman inside the car looked down at the steering wheel. The crowd had thinned slightly, but a few people were still watching. The manager stood with his arms crossed, clearly annoyed. Then the sliding doors opened again. Ethan stepped outside, carrying a small paper bag and 2 cups of coffee. He walked straight back to the sedan. Without saying much, he held one of the cups toward the window. "Here," he said. The woman hesitated. "You don't have to." "It's just coffee," Ethan replied gently. After a moment, she accepted it. Her hands were cold as she wrapped them around the warm cup. Ethan then handed her the paper bag. "There's a breakfast sandwich in there." For the first time since the confrontation began, the woman's expression softened. "Thank you," she said quietly. The manager shook his head in frustration. "You are encouraging this," he muttered. Ethan glanced toward him but said nothing. Back near the truck, the triplets were whispering again. Noah pointed toward the back seat of the sedan. "Look," he said. Liam squinted. Under the blanket sat a pillow and a small suitcase. "She really lives there," Liam murmured. But Mason was watching the woman instead. She had opened the bag slowly, almost carefully, as if she didn't want to bag slowly, almost carefully. "Oh, waste a single crumb." For a few minutes, the tension in the parking lot eased. The woman took a small bite of the sandwich and nodded her thanks again. "I'll move soon," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Ethan leaned against the side of the car. "What's your name?" he asked. "Grace," she answered. Grace Bennett. Before Ethan could respond, the manager sighed loudly. "5 minutes," he said. "Then I'm calling the police." Grace nodded. "I understand." But the moment that truly mattered came seconds later. Back near the truck, Mason opened his lunchbox and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing, a crayon picture the triplets had made a few nights earlier. 3 small stick figures stood beside a taller one. Above them floated another figure with wings. Their mom. Mason walked quietly toward the car again. Ethan noticed him but didn't stop him. The boy reached the window and gently slid the drawing through the small opening. Grace looked down at it in confusion. For a moment she simply stared at the colorful picture. Then she noticed the tiny names written above the figures. Noah, Liam, Mason, and Ethan. Her fingers tightened around the paper. Something about the drawing made her eyes glisten. She looked up at the boy. "Why are you giving me this?" she asked softly. Mason shrugged. "So you don't feel alone." For the first time that morning, Grace didn't look embarrassed. She looked stunned, but what no one in that parking lot realized was that the situation was about to change again. Because just as Grace lifted her eyes from the drawing, flashing lights appeared at the far end of the parking lot. A police cruiser slowly turned into the Walmart entrance and rolled toward the group. The manager straightened immediately. But Officer Daniel Ruiz wasn't looking at the manager. His eyes were fixed on the woman sitting inside the fogged win. Dow car. Grace almost pushed the crayon, drawing back through the car window. For a moment it felt too personal, too strange to accept something like that from a child she had just met. But just before she returned it, her eyes stopped on one small detail in the corner of the paper. One of the stick figures had wings. Grace held the drawing closer, studying the picture carefully. 4 small figures stood side by side, holding hands. Above them floated another figure with uneven crayon wings and a small, smiling face. Grace blinked slowly. Her eyes moved to the small handwritten names above each stick figure. Noah, Liam, Mason, and Ethan. For a long moment she said nothing. The boy standing beside the car window shifted his weight nervously. Mason watched her reaction with quiet patience. Finally Grace looked up. "Who's the one with the wings?" she asked softly. Mason pointed at the drawing. "That's our mom." The words were simple, but they carried a quiet weight. Grace's expression changed. "What happened to her?" she asked carefully. Noah stepped closer to the car, she asked carefully. Noah stepped closer to the car. "She got sick," he explained, 3 years ago. Liam added the rest. "She lives in heaven now." The cold air in the parking lot suddenly felt heavier. Grace lowered her eyes to the drawing again. For a moment she traced the winged figure with her thumb. Then she spoke again. "My mom passed away too," she said quietly. The boys looked up at her. "When?" Mason asked. 2 years ago." There was no drama in the way she said it, just the tired honesty of someone who had repeated the truth too many times. But what no one around the car realized was that the conversation was slowly changing something. Not just for Grace, for Ethan too. He had been standing quietly beside the sedan, listening without interrupting, watching, understanding. Because grief had a way of recognizing itself. But the real turning point had not arrived yet. Grace carefully folded the drawing and rested it on her lap. For the first time that morning, she didn't look like someone trying to disappear. She looked like someone remembering something she had almost lost. Ethan cleared his throat gently. "Have you eaten anything besides that sandwich today?" he asked. Grace shook her head. "That's enough," she said quickly. Ethan studied her for a moment. Then he glanced toward the store entrance. "Come inside," he said. Grace hesitated. "I shouldn't. It's just breakfast." She looked toward the Walmart building, then back at the parking lot. Several people were still watching from a distance. The manager stood near the entrance with a stiff expression. Grace's shoulders tensed again. The attention made everything worse. But Mason spoke up before she could refuse. "They have pancakes in there," he said. Grace almost laughed. Almost a small smile flickered across her face before disappearing again. And a moment later she slowly opened the car door. The Walmart cafe was warm and quiet compared to the cold parking lot outside. A few early shoppers sat at the tables drinking coffee. The triplets slid into a booth beside Ethan while Grace sat carefully across from them. She looked slightly uncomfortable, like she didn't quite belong there. Ethan returned a few minutes later carrying a tray: eggs, toast, pancakes, coffee. Grace stared at the food for a second. "You really didn't have to do that," she said softly. Ethan shrugged. "Kids insisted." Mason nodded seriously. Grace picked up her fork slowly. But before she took a bite, Noah spoke again. "Why were you sleeping in your car?" The question was innocent, but it made Grace pause. She glanced at Ethan briefly. Then she looked back at the boys. "It's just temporary," she said. Her voice remained calm, but the truth behind it was obvious. Medical bills had wiped out her savings. Her apartment was gone, and finding work after months of hospital visits had been nearly impossible. So the car had become the only place left. For a moment the booth grew quiet. Then Liam leaned forward. "That's not fair." Grace blinked. "What isn't?" "That you don't have a house." The simple statement hung in the air. Grace didn't know how to answer that. Because sometimes life wasn't fair, and children were often the first ones brave enough to say it out loud. But the moment that truly mattered came seconds later. Ethan looked across the table at Grace with a thoughtful expression. He had spent the last few minutes quietly studying the situation, not judging, not rushing, just noticing the details, the tired eyes, the careful way she saved half the pancakes, the way she still clutched the crayon, drawing like it meant something. And slowly, something began to shift in his mind. He didn't say anything yet, but he was starting to think about what could happen next. However, outside the cafe windows, another development was already unfolding. The manager stood near the entrance again, speaking into his phone, and a few minutes later, flashing lights appeared at the edge of the parking lot. Grace noticed them first. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "What is it?" Noah asked. Grace didn't answer. She simply looked toward the glass doors, because the red and blue lights were growing brighter. A police cruiser rolled slowly into the Walmart parking lot. The driver's door opened. Officer Daniel Ruiz stepped out and looked directly toward Grace's parked car, and within seconds he began walking toward the entrance of the store. The red and blue police lights reflected off the frost-covered windshield of Grace's car just as the automatic Walmart door slid open again. Inside the cafe, Grace saw the cruiser first, and the color drained from her face. Grace's hand tightened around the coffee cup. Across the table, Mason noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked quietly. Grace didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the parking lot outside the glass doors. The flashing lights painted slow colors across the pavement. Ethan followed her gaze. A police cruiser had stopped a few rows away from Grace's sedan. The driver's door opened. Officer Daniel Ruiz stepped out, and he was already looking directly at the car. For a moment, the entire table went silent. Then Liam turned toward Ethan. "Dad, are they here for her?" Ethan didn't respond right away. But what happened next changed the mood in the cafe instantly. The Walmart manager, Harold Dixon, appeared near the entrance again and walked quickly toward the officer. They spoke briefly. Then both men looked toward the store, toward Grace. Grace slowly set her coffee down. "I should move my car," she said quietly. Her voice carried the tired resignation of someone used to leaving before things became worse. But Mason shook his head. "You didn't even finish your pancakes." Grace managed a faint smile. "I'll be okay." But the real turning point had not arrived yet. Because as Grace stood from the booth, Ethan stood with her. "I'll walk out with you," he said. Grace hesitated. "You don't have to." "I know." The triplets followed closely behind them as they walked toward the glass doors. Outside, the cold air hit them immediately. Officer Ruiz had already reached the sedan. He turned when he heard footsteps approaching. Grace slowed when she saw him. For a moment she looked like she might turn around and go back inside. But Ethan continued walking beside her. Officer Ruiz gave a calm nod. "Ma'am." Grace stopped beside the car. "Good morning," she said quietly. Behind the officer, the store manager folded his arms. "She's been parked here overnight several times." "She's been parked here overnight several times," Harold said quickly. "We've warned her before." Grace lowered her eyes. "I wasn't trying to cause trouble. A few nearby shoppers had already noticed the police car. Two people paused with their shopping carts. Another person quietly pulled out a phone. The scene was beginning to draw attention again. Back near Ethan, the boys shifted nervously. Liam stepped forward first. "She didn't do anything wrong," he said. Ethan gently rested a hand on his shoulder, but Officer Ruiz had already noticed the children. His eyes moved between them and Grace. Then he asked a simple question. "Ma'am, were you staying in the vehicle overnight?" Grace hesitated. For a moment it looked like she might deny it, but instead she nodded. "Yes." The manager exhaled loudly. "There you go." But the officer didn't respond to him. Instead, he looked at Grace again. "Do you have somewhere safe you can go today?" Grace looked down at the pavement. "I'll leave," she said. Her voice was steady, but Mason noticed something others didn't. Grace was still holding the crayon drawing. She hadn't let go of it once. The moment that truly mattered came seconds later. Mason stepped beside Ethan and looked up at the officer. "She's our friend," he said. Officer Ruiz blinked. "Your friend?" Mason nodded seriously. "She was just eating breakfast with us." The officer looked toward Ethan. Ethan met his gaze calmly. "We were helping her warm up," he said. For a moment, the tension in the parking lot shifted. The officer studied Grace again. Her thin jacket, the blanket still folded inside the back seat, the tired expression she couldn't quite hide. Something about the situation didn't match the manager's frustration. And Officer Ruiz noticed, but the situation was about to become even more complicated. "Ma'am," he said gently, "may I see some identification?" Grace nodded slowly. "Of course." She opened the driver's door and lay, Annette inside the car. For a moment she searched through the glove compartment. Papers rustled softly. Receipts, documents, old envelopes. Then she pulled out a small stack and handed it toward the officer. But what no one realized was that something inside those papers was about to change everything. Officer Ruiz glanced down as he sorted through them. His eyes moved quickly across the first document, then the second, and suddenly he stopped. The officer looked back toward Grace. His expression had changed completely. Tucked between the paperwork was a hospital discharge form. The date was only a few weeks old, and the diagnosis printed at the top made Officer Ruiz look up at Grace in stunned silence. Officer Ruiz looked down at the hospital discharge paper in his hands. Then he looked back up at Grace, and suddenly the situation in the Walmart parking lot didn't look the same anymore. For a few seconds the officer said nothing. The winter air moved quietly through the parking lot as the small group waited. Grace noticed the paper in his hand, and her shoulders stiffened. She already knew what he was reading, but she didn't reach for the document. She just stood there. Officer Ruiz glanced down at the page again. The printed hospital logo sat clearly at the top. Below it was a discharge summary dated only a few weeks earlier. His eyes moved slowly across the lines. Then he exhaled quietly. "What hospital treated you?" he asked. Grace answered without lifting her head. Syed Bask answered, without lifting her head. "St. Matthew's Regional." The officer nodded slightly. "And you're still recovering?" Grace hesitated before answering. Her voice was soft, but the truth inside that word was heavier than it sounded. The officer flipped to the second page. More paperwork, medical billing statements, prescription instructions, follow-up appointments. But what happened next changed the atmosphere in the parking lot. Immediately, Officer Ruiz noticed the diagnosis printed near the top of the document. He paused again, then he folded the paper halfway and looked toward the manager. Terrell Dixon had been watching the entire interaction impatiently. "Well," the manager asked, "she's still not supposed to park here overnight." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked back at Grace. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you recently completed cancer treatment." The word hung in the air. Cancer. Several nearby shoppers stopped moving. One of the people holding a phone slowly lowered it. Grace nodded faintly. "Last month." Her voice sounded distant, like she had repeated the explanation too many times already. The officer glanced at the paperwork again. "And you had surgery recently, too?" Grace nodded again. "Yes." The parking lot had grown quiet. Even the manager looked momentarily unsure how to respond. But the real truth hadn't surfaced yet. Officer Ruiz continued reading. The paperwork explained everything. The long hospital stay, the treatments, the prescriptions, and the overwhelming medical bills that followed. Grace had lost her apartment only weeks after leaving the hospital. She had tried to find temporary work, but recovery made even simple tasks exhausting. Eventually, the car became the only place left. Back near Ethan, the triplets were listening carefully. Liam frowned. "She was sick?" he asked. Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah." Noah glanced at the car again. "That's why she looks tired." Mason looked at Grace with new understanding. But the moment that truly mattered came seconds later. Grace finally spoke again. "I know I'm not supposed to stay here," she said quietly. "I'll move the car." She reached for the door handle, but Officer Ruiz raised a hand gently. "Hold on a moment." Grace froze. The officer looked toward the manager again. Harold cleared his throat. "Well, rules are rules." But his voice didn't sound as confident as before. A few shoppers nearby had begun whispering. The tension in the parking lot had shifted. Now the crowd wasn't watching Grace with judgment. They were watching the manager, and he could feel it. The officer finally handed the paperwork back to Grace. "Thank you," he said quietly. Grace took the papers and placed them carefully inside the car again. Her fingers brushed the silver bracelet on her wrist. The small piece of jewelry glimmered faintly in the morning light. It was the only thing she still owned from her mother, the only thing that survived the eviction. But what no one realized was that the real turning point was happening beside the car. Ethan had been watching everything, listening, thinking. Something inside him had been shifting since the moment Mason first asked Grace if she had eaten breakfast. And now the decision forming in his mind was becoming clearer. He looked at the boys. They were still standing beside him, watching Grace with quiet concern. Then Mason stepped forward again. "She's not hurting anyone," the child said. The officer glanced down at him. "That's true," he said. For a moment the cold air carried only silence. Finally, Officer Ruiz turned toward the manager. "I think she's had a rough enough morning already," he said calmly. Harold opened his mouth to argue. He said calmly. Harold opened his mouth to argue, but then he noticed several people still watching, and the argument faded. The officer turned back to Grace. "You're not in trouble," he said quietly. Grace blinked. For the first time that morning, relief flickered across her face. But the story wasn't finished yet, because Ethan stepped forward before the moment could end. He looked at Grace. Then he asked a question that surprised everyone standing there. "Grace," Ethan said carefully, "do you have somewhere warm to stay tonight?" Grace looked at him in confusion, and then Ethan added the words no one expected to hear. "You could stay at my place if you want." Grace didn't answer Ethan's question right away. She simply stared at him, as if she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly, because no one had offered her a place to stay in a very long time. For a moment, the Walmart parking lot fell silent again. The officer looked between Ethan and Grace with mild surprise. Even the manager seemed caught off guard. Grace blinked slowly. "You don't mean that," she said quietly, but Ethan didn't look away. "I do," he replied. Grace shook her head almost immediately. "No, I can't do that." Her reaction came quickly, almost automatically. It wasn't anger. It was fear, the kind of hesitation that comes from learning not to rely on strangers. But what happened next changed the tone of the moment. Mason stepped forward first. "You can sleep in our house," he said. Matter-of-factly, Grace looked down at him, unsure how to respond. Then Noah joined in. "We have a couch," he added. Liam crossed his arms proudly. "And we have pancakes." The small comments made several people nearby smile quietly. Grace exhaled softly. "You boys are very kind," she said. But the hesitation in her voice remained. She looked back at Ethan. "You don't even know me." Ethan shrugged lightly. "I know enough." Grace studied his face. She wasn't used to people offering help without conditions. But the real turning point had not arrived yet, because across the parking lot someone raised a phone and began recording. The video captured the moment. A tired woman standing beside her car. A single father offering help. 3 small boys defending her like they had known her forever. Within minutes, the clip would begin spreading across social media, but none of them realized that yet. Grace still stood beside the car, unsure what to do. Officer Ruiz stepped slightly closer. "You don't have to decide right now," he said gently, "but somewhere warm would probably help with your recovery." Grace lowered her eyes. Her fingers brushed the silver bracelet again. The small piece of jewelry had survived everything. Hospital stays, eviction, weeks of sleeping in the car, but trusting someone again felt harder than surviving all of that. The moment that truly mattered came seconds later. Mason reached up and tugged gently on Ethan's sleeve. "Dad," he whispered. Ethan leaned down slightly. "She still has our drawing," Mason said. Ethan glanced at Grace's hand. The crayon picture was still folded carefully between her fingers. She hadn't let go of it. That small detail said more than anything else. Grace looked at the boys again. 3 hopeful faces staring up at her. Waiting, not judging. Just hoping. Slowly, she nodded. "Maybe, just for tonight." Relief spread across Mason's face immediately. "Good," he said. Grace managed a faint smile, but the situation wasn't finished yet, because something else was already beginning to spread beyond the parking lot. The person filming the scene posted the video online before leaving the store. Within minutes, it began appearing on local community pages. The caption was simple. "Single dad helps homeless woman outside Walmart." Back in the parking lot, Ethan walked toward his truck. "You can follow us," he told Grace. Grace nodded and climbed back into the sedan. Her movements were careful. Still tired, still cautious, but something inside her had shifted. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't driving somewhere just to find another place to park overnight. Ethan's house sat on a quiet street on the edge of Cedar Ridge. It was small, 2 bedrooms, a narrow front porch, but the warm yellow lights glowing through the windows made it feel welcoming. Grace parked behind Ethan's truck and stepped out slowly. The boys were already racing toward the front door. "This is our house," Liam announced proudly. Grace followed Ethan inside. The warmth of the home wrapped around her immediately. It smelled faintly like coffee and laundry soap. The living room was simple but comfortable. A worn couch, a small bookshelf, a wooden table covered in homework papers. But what caught Grace's attention first were the photographs on the wall. Family pictures, birthday parties, a woman with bright eyes standing beside Ethan in several of them. Grace paused in front of the photos. "That's Emily," Ethan said quietly. Grace turned toward him. "My wife." Grace studied the picture again. Emily's smile looked warm and genuine. "She looks kind," Grace said softly. "She was," Ethan replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Grief had a quiet way of recognizing itself. But the real turning point had not arrived yet. Grace finally looked around the room again. "You really don't have to do this," she said. Ethan shrugged lightly. "It's just a couch." Grace nodded slowly. "Just one night," she said. "That's all I'll ask." But what happened later that evening would make that promise much harder to keep. The boys had fallen asleep upstairs after dinner. The house had grown quiet. Grace sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket Ethan had given her. For a moment she looked peaceful, then something changed. Ethan noticed it first. Grace's face suddenly lost color. Her hand gripped the edge of the couch. "Grace," he said. She'd try. She, too, eyed to answer. But the room tilted around her. Grace swayed slightly before collapsing back against the couch. And Ethan realized something was very wrong. Grace's hand slipped from the edge of the kitchen counter. For a split second, she tried to steady herself. Then her knees buckled, and she collapsed before Ethan could reach her. The sound of the fall echoed through the quiet house. Ethan reacted instantly. "Grace!" He crossed the room in 2 steps and caught her before she hit the floor completely. Her body felt frighteningly light, and her skin was cold. Grace tried to speak, but the words didn't come out clearly. "I'm fine," she murmured weakly. But Ethan could already see that she wasn't. Her breathing was shallow, and her face had gone pale again. Scene: Grace collapsing in the kitchen. Grace collapsing in the kitchen. Reaction: Ethan catches her and lowers her carefully to the floor. Emotion: sudden fear and urgency. New situation: Ethan realizes she needs medical help immediately. But the real turning point hadn't arrived yet. Ethan reached for his phone and called for help while keeping one hand steady on Grace's shoulder. Within minutes, flashing ambulance lights illuminated the quiet Cedar Ridge street outside the house. The boys woke up upstairs when they heard the noise. By the time Ethan stepped onto the front porch with the paramedics, 3 sleepy faces were already peeking down the staircase. "What happened?" Liam asked anxiously. Ethan forced his voice to stay calm. "She just needs to see a doctor," but Mason noticed something others might have missed. Grace was still clutching the folded crayon drawing in her hand, even now. The hospital emergency room felt cold and bright after the warmth of Ethan's house. Doctors and nurses moved quickly around Grace's bed as Ethan stood near the doorway. The triplets waited quietly in the chairs beside him. No one spoke for several minutes. Then a doctor finally approached them. "She's stable," the doctor explained. Ethan nodded with visible relief. "What happened?" he asked. The doctor glanced down at the medical chart. "Her body is still recovering from major treatment," he said. "Exhaustion, stress, and lack of proper rest can cause sudden weakness like this." Grace hadn't been fully recovered yet. Sleeping in a car, living in constant stress, barely eating, all of it had pushed her body too far. But what happened next changed everything in a way none of them expected. Back in Cedar Ridge, the short video recorded in the Walmart parking lot had begun spreading across the internet. At first it appeared on a small local community page. Then someone shared it again. Within hours, thousands of people had watched the clip. The comments began appearing quickly. People asking questions, people offering help, people criticizing the store manager's behavior. And then something even bigger happened. A local news station picked up the story. Single father and his triplets help homeless cancer patient outside Walmart. By the next morning, Cedar Ridge was talking about little else. At the hospital, however, none of that was visible yet. Ethan sat quietly in the waiting room beside the boys. Liam swung his legs nervously from the chair. Noah watched the hallway. Mason held the crayon drawing in both hands. He had taken it gently from Grace when the paramedics lifted her onto the stretcher. "What if she can't come back to the house?" Liam asked quietly. Ethan rubbed his forehead. "We'll figure something out." But the moment that truly mattered came seconds later. A nurse stepped into the waiting room. "She's awake," the nurse said softly. Ethan stood immediately. "Can we see her?" The nurse nodded. The boys followed him down the hallway. Grace looked fragile lying in the hospital bed, but her eyes opened slowly when they entered the room. Mason stepped forward first. "I kept your drawing safe," he said. Grace smiled faintly. Her fingers wrapped around the paper again. For a moment she studied the picture. Then she looked at Ethan. "I'm sorry about tonight," she said quietly. "You don't have to apologize," Ethan replied, but Grace's voice trembled slightly. "You've already done more for me than anyone should." The hospital room grew quiet again, but outside those walls, something important was already happening. Donations had begun appearing online. People from Cedar Ridge were organizing help, and the Walmart manager who had started the confrontation that morning was now facing a flood of criticism. Yet inside the hospital room, the most important moment was still unfolding. Grace looked down at the drawing again. Then she looked at Ethan. For a long moment she didn't speak. Her eyes filled slowly with tears she had been holding back for weeks. But what no one realized was that this moment was about to change everything between them. Ethan stepped toward the door. He didn't want to overwhelm her. He figured she probably needed rest. But just before he could leave, Grace spoke again. "Ethan," he turned back. Grace's voice was quiet but steady. "Thank you for seeing me." And the emotion behind those words stopped him in the doorway. 3 months later, the Walmart parking lot in Cedar Ridge looked completely different. But the place where Grace Bennett had once slept inside a fogged-window car was still easy to recognize. And standing there again brought back memories none of them would ever forget. The early spring morning felt warmer than the cold day when everything had started. Cars moved in and out of the Walmart lot like any normal day. Shoppers pushed carts toward the entrance. Nothing about the scene looked unusual anymore. But for Ethan Carter and the 3 boys climbing out of his pickup truck, the parking lot carried a very different meaning. "This is the spot," Noah said quietly. He pointed to the row of spaces near the entrance, the exact place where the gray sedan had once sat overnight. The boys stood there for a moment, remembering 3 months earlier, everything had felt uncertain. Grace had been weak from treatment. Her future had looked unclear, and Ethan had simply tried to help one person through a difficult morning. But what happened next had changed more than any of them expected, because the video from that parking lot had continued spreading across the internet. At first it reached a few hundred people, then thousands, eventually millions. The story caught the attention of people far outside Cedar Ridge. Messages of support arrived from everywhere. Donations began appearing on a community fundraiser page created by a local church. At first, Grace felt uncomfortable accepting help, but the moment that truly mattered came seconds later. Ethan showed her one of the messages. A woman who had survived cancer wrote a short note. "Someone once helped me when I had nothing. Let people help you now." Grace read the message twice, then she quietly accepted. Within weeks, the fundraiser had covered most of her medical bills. The hospital even reduced part of the remaining cost. But that wasn't the only change happening, because the story had also reached people inside Cedar Ridge. Local businesses offered support, neighbors dropped off meals, and the small bookstore near Main Street offered Grace a part-time job once she felt strong enough to work again. Now, 3 months later, Grace was standing beside Ethan's truck in the same parking lot where everything had begun, but she looked completely different, healthier, stronger. Her posture carried quiet confidence instead of exhaustion, and the silver bracelet on her wrist still glimmered softly in the morning light. "Ready?" Ethan asked. Grace nodded. Together, they walked toward the store entrance. The triplets followed closely behind them. Inside the store, several employees immediately recognized them. The story had become part of local history. A few people waved, others smiled quietly. The manager who had started the confrontation that day was no longer working there. The company had transferred him shortly after the video went viral. But what no one realized was that the most meaningful moment of the morning was still waiting. The boys led Grace toward a small bench near the front windows. Mason carefully removed something from his backpack, a simple wooden frame. Inside it sat the same crayon drawing he had given her in the parking lot that morning. The 4 stick figures stood side by side, and above them, the small figure with wings still floated gently. Grace stared at the drawing. "You framed it," she said softly. Mason nodded proudly. "So it doesn't get lost." Grace's eyes filled with emotion again. But this time, the tears carried warmth instead of pain. She looked toward Ethan. "You didn't just give me a place to stay," she said quietly. "You gave me a way to start again." Ethan shrugged gently. "I think the boys deserve most of the credit." Liam grinned. "We are pretty helpful." Noah nodded in agreement, but Mason stepped closer to Grace. He held her hand for a moment. Then he said something simple. "Now you're part of our team." Grace laughed softly through the tears. And in that moment, something quiet but important settled between all of them. No. Tea obligation. Not charity. Something deeper. Something closer to family. But the real turning point had not arrived yet, because as they walked back outside into the warm spring sunlight, Mason said something unexpected again. "Can we call you Miss Grace now?" Grace looked down at him. "That sounds nice," she said. But Liam shook his head. "That's too formal." Noah thought for a moment. Then he smiled. "How about just Grace?" Grace looked toward Ethan. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan nodded slightly, and the small silence between them carried a new understanding. A quiet affection that had grown slowly over the past months. No rushing, no pressure, just 2 people who had helped each other stand again. The parking lot stretched quietly behind them as they walked toward the truck, the same place where Grace had once spent cold nights inside a parked car. Now the space stood empty, just another ordinary parking spot. But for the people walking away from it together, it would always be the place where everything had changed. As Ethan opened the truck door, Mason suddenly pointed back toward the parking lot. "Dad, look." Parked near the same spot where Grace's car once stood was another vehicle with fogged windows. And the boys realized someone else inside might need help too. If this story touched your heart, take a second to show it some love, so more people can see how powerful a small act of kindness can be. Share it with someone who believes the world still needs more compassion. And stay with us for more stories that remind us what humanity really looks like. Because sometimes the smallest moment can change someone's entire life, just like it did for Grace. But here's something to think about. If you had been in that parking lot that morning, would you have walked away like everyone else, or would you have stopped?